Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to slowly drift through one of the strangest corners of the medieval world. Marriage. Not the romantic version you see in movies, but the real, legal, and often absurd rules that governed who could marry whom, how a wedding was supposed to happen, and what happened when it all went wrong. There is no need to remember any of this. Just relax. Close your eyes if you like, and let your mind wander as we move gently through the quiet, dusty corners of medieval law and custom. If you find yourself drifting off before the end, that is exactly what this video is for. Let's begin. In the Middle Ages, marriage had very little to do with love. It was above almost everything else a contract. Families used marriage to move land from one household to another, to settle old debts, to end feuds between neighboring villages, or to climb a little higher on the social ladder. Among the nobility, a marriage could seal a peace treaty between two warring regions. Among peasants, it could combine two small farms into one slightly less small farm. Children were sometimes betrothed before they could even walk. A boy of 4 and a girl of 3 might be promised to each other by their parents over a handshake and a cup of wine, with neither child having the faintest idea what had just happened to their future. The church did eventually require that both parties consent to the marriage once they came of age, but in practice, a peasant girl or a young nobleman rarely felt they had much choice at all. Saying no to your family's chosen match could mean losing your inheritance, your home, or your place in the community entirely. So most people simply went along with it, the way one goes along with the weather. Officially, canon law set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. This sounds shocking today, and it should. But it's worth understanding what this actually meant in practice. A formal betrothal, a legal promise to marry, could happen much earlier, sometimes in early childhood, arranged entirely by parents for political or financial reasons. The marriage itself, meaning the point where the couple would actually live together as husband and wife, was usually delayed until both parties were considered physically mature enough, which in most historical records tended to be the later teenage years, particularly among common people who needed both partners to be capable of manual labor and childbearing. Among royalty and high nobility, however, very young marriages did sometimes happen for political convenience, and these unions were often left unconsummated for years, with the young bride sent to live at her husband's family's household simply to be raised there until she was older. Church officials occasionally spoke out against marrying off children too young, but enforcement varied wildly from region to region and century to century. Before any couple could marry in a parish church, the priests were required to announce their intention to marry on 3 separate Sundays or holy days, usually a few weeks apart. This announcement was called the reading of the banns. The purpose was simple. It gave the community a chance to speak up if they knew of any reason the couple should not marry. Perhaps one of them was already secretly married elsewhere. Perhaps they were closer blood relatives than anyone realized. Perhaps one of them had made a vow to the church that conflicted with a wedding. Villages were small and everyone knew everyone's business, so this public announcement system worked surprisingly well as an early form of background check. If no objections were raised after 3 readings, the couple was free to proceed. If someone did object, the wedding could be delayed indefinitely while church officials investigated the claim, sometimes for months, sometimes even for years, depending on how complicated the situation turned out to be. One of the strangest and most complicated areas of medieval marriage law involved something called the forbidden degrees of consanguinity, which is simply a formal way of describing how closely related two people could be and still be allowed to marry. For much of the medieval period, the church forbade marriage between relatives up to the seventh degree, a definition so broad that it could technically include very distant cousins that a person might not have even known existed. In small villages where everyone had lived and intermarried in the same small area for generations, this created a real practical headache because it was entirely possible to be distantly related to nearly everyone else in town without realizing it. Later, the rule was narrowed to the fourth degree, which was still fairly broad by modern standards. Nobility, who tended to marry within a very small pool of other noble families across Europe to preserve wealth and status, ran into this problem constantly. The solution quite often was to purchase what was called a dispensation from the church, essentially official permission to marry despite being related in exchange for a fee or a favor. This meant that, in a strange twist, the wealthiest families could simply pay their way around a rule that was strictly enforced against everyone else. When a woman married in medieval Europe, she typically brought with her a dowry, a payment of money, land, livestock, or household goods given by her family to the groom or his family. The size of the dowry often determined how desirable a bride was considered, sometimes even more than her personal qualities. A poor family with a lovely, kind daughter might struggle to find her a husband if they could not offer a competitive dowry, while a wealthy family could sometimes secure a good match for a daughter, regardless of her temperament, simply because of the size of the payment attached to her. This created enormous financial pressure on families with multiple daughters. Saving for 2, 3, or 4 dowries could bankrupt a modest household, which is part of the reason why convents became such an important option. Sending a daughter to become a nun required a much smaller payment to the church than a full marriage dowry, making it a financially practical choice for families who could not afford to marry off every daughter. In some regions, if a marriage ended in divorce or annulment, complicated legal arguments would follow about whether the dowry had to be returned, and to whom, and in what condition. A medieval wedding did not look like the elaborate white dress ceremonies we picture today. For most common people, the actual legal ceremony was remarkably brief and simple, often taking place not inside the church, but just outside its front doors, in the church porch, with the priest blessing the couple before everyone moved inside for a wedding mass. Brides did not traditionally wear white. That tradition would not become popular until many centuries later. Instead, a bride wore her best dress, whatever color that happened to be, often blue, which was associated with purity in medieval symbolism, or simply whatever fine fabric her family could afford. After the ceremony came the celebration, and this is where medieval villages truly let loose. Feasting, dancing, music, and drinking could last for days among wealthier families, while poorer villagers might celebrate with a simple shared meal and perhaps a barrel of ale contributed by neighbors. One curious tradition in parts of medieval England and elsewhere involved something called bride ale, where the community would essentially buy drinks from the newly married couple as a way of gifting them money to start their new household, an early and rather practical form of a wedding registry. In medieval canon law, a marriage was not always considered fully and permanently binding until it had been consummated. This might sound like a private matter, but in the medieval world it was often treated as something closer to a legal formality. Among royalty especially, where the stakes of a marriage alliance were enormous, witnesses were sometimes required to confirm that a marriage had indeed been consummated.
occasionally even being present in the general vicinity of the bedchamber, though customs on exactly how far this went varied by region and time period. This was not simply gossip or tradition, it had real legal weight. If a marriage was never consummated, it could later be annulled, meaning legally erased as though it had never happened at all, which was very different from a divorce. This became an important tool for royal families who needed a way out of a politically inconvenient marriage. Claiming non-consummation, even sometimes falsely, was one of the few accepted paths toward dissolving a union that the church would otherwise consider permanent and unbreakable. Unlike annulment, true divorce, in the sense of legally ending a valid, consummated marriage, was almost unheard of in medieval Christian Europe. The church considered marriage a sacrament, a permanent bond blessed by God, and generally refused to dissolve it except in the most extreme circumstances. Couples who found themselves deeply unhappy together had very few official options. Some sought a legal separation, which allowed them to live apart and stop sharing a household, but crucially did not permit either person to remarry, since in the eyes of the church, they were still bound to one another. Others pursued annulment by trying to prove the marriage had never been valid in the first place, perhaps due to a forbidden degree of relation nobody had noticed, a prior secret betrothal, or a lack of proper consent at the time of the wedding.
These cases could drag on for years in church courts, involving witnesses, testimonies, and enormous legal expense, which meant that in practice, this option was really only available to the wealthy and powerful, while ordinary unhappy couples simply had to endure their circumstances for the rest of their lives. Death, unfortunately, was a far more common way for a medieval marriage to end than divorce ever was. Given the harsh realities of medieval life, disease, childbirth complications, warfare, and general hardship, it was extremely common for people to be widowed, sometimes more than once in a single lifetime. Widows occupied an interesting and somewhat unusual position in medieval society. Unlike unmarried daughters, a widow, particularly one who had inherited property or a share of her late husband's estate, could have a surprising degree of legal and financial independence for the time. Some widows chose never to remarry at all, preferring to manage their own households, farms, or even businesses on their own terms, a freedom that marriage itself often did not allow them. Others remarried quickly, sometimes out of financial necessity, sometimes because a household simply could not function efficiently without a second adult, particularly if there were young children or a farm to manage. Remarriage rules for widows were generally much simpler than the rules for first marriages, since there was no longer a question of an intact family's approval to navigate, though a waiting period was sometimes expected as a matter of social respectability. The experience of marriage in the medieval world depended enormously on social class. Among peasants, marriage was often a fairly practical arrangement between two people of similar standing in the same village, and while parents certainly had influence, some historical records suggest that ordinary peasants had somewhat more personal say in choosing a spouse than is commonly assumed, since there was simply less political and financial complexity at stake compared to noble unions.
A peasant wedding was, in many ways, a community celebration as much as a legal event. Nobility, by contrast, experienced marriage as high-stakes diplomacy. A noble daughter or son might be betrothed for reasons having nothing to do with personal preference at all, but rather territorial boundaries, military alliances, or royal succession. Noble weddings were elaborate, expensive, and heavily documented, often involving travel across great distances, as a bride left her homeland entirely to live among strangers in her husband's territory, sometimes never seeing her own family again. This meant that, in a strange reversal of what many assume, ordinary people in medieval villages sometimes had more genuine personal connection in their marriages than the wealthy nobility
whose unions were treated as instruments of statecraft.
Medieval people surrounded marriage with a whole world of superstition and folk belief, much of it designed to bring good luck to the new household or ward off misfortune. Certain days of the week were considered luckier for weddings than others, with many communities avoiding weddings during particular religious seasons altogether, such as during Lent. Brides sometimes carried herbs or wore certain colors believed to protect against evil spirits or jealousy from unmarried women in the village. In some regions, it was considered important for the bride to enter her new home by stepping over the threshold rather than walking directly through the doorway, a tradition some historians believe was meant to prevent evil spirits lurking at ground level from following her inside.
Wedding rings were worn on the fourth finger of the left hand because of an old belief, likely originating even before the medieval period, that a vein in that particular finger ran directly to the heart. None of this was formally required by the church, of course, but folk custom and official religion existed comfortably side by side in the daily lives of medieval people, blending together into the rich, strange tapestry of medieval domestic life. And on that quiet note, we'll let this village fall silent for the night. Thank you for spending this time with Boring History for Sleep. Rest well, and we'll see you in the next one.